My name is Florence Whitlow, and I don't cry anymore. Not after 50 years of marriage. Not after 3 grown children. Not after church Sundays and funeral Tuesdays and casseroles that were never eaten. Not after the night my husband told me without looking up from his suitcase that he had met someone who made him feel alive. No, I didn't cry. I watched. I watched the man I once met beneath a chapel's oak tree fold socks like he was packing for a weekend trip to the coast. I watched him fumble with his cufflinks as if unsure how to say goodbye to someone who once waded through his deployment, stitched his shirts, and memorized the sound of his heart. He said it like it was weather. "It's just time, Florence." I didn't ask what that meant. And when he walked out slower than he thought he would, I stayed standing. The silence he left was the kind of silence that hums like a piano pedal held just long enough for sadness to echo. He didn't even take his mug. You might actually regret missing out on this dramatic story. So before you sit down and listen, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to Grace's Truth. Because this isn't just a story about betrayal, it's about how silence can sometimes sing louder than fury. The first night he was gone, I didn't sleep in the bed. Not because I missed him. I just couldn't bring myself to lie on the left side, the side I hadn't touched in years. I used to curl up facing him even when we argued. It was muscle memory. A wife's spine bends toward her husband even in sleep. So I slept in the guest room. It smelled like dust and lavender sachets. A room no one had used since my sister visited last spring. I laid under that floral quilt listening to the refrigerator hum like an old friend trying not to make it awkward. Around 3 a.m. The streetlight cast the faint shape of his favorite chair across the hallway wall. I should have burned it. Instead, I made tea. The note he left, if you can call it that, was folded on the kitchen table. "I need to feel alive again." 8 words. No signature. I stared at it while the kettle screamed, wondering if this was what aliveness felt like. Let me tell you something. There is a kind of death in being invisible to the man you once held up during his mother's funeral. But there is also a kind of resurrection. I didn't know it yet, but I would rise. I would not rise with fire, or tears, or shouting across courtrooms. No, I would rise with piano keys and real estate law. I would rise in quiet, in motion, in ink and iron. But that first night, I just made tea. The second night, I opened the cedar chest. You know the one? The chest women of our generation were given as girls, where we placed wedding dresses, baby blankets, and letters we never sent. I sat on the floor of my bedroom, knees cracking, and lifted the lid. The smell of time. Inside. Our wedding photo. Me in a high-collared ivory gown. Him in a borrowed suit. His mother said my veil was too long. I wore it anyway. Next to that, a deed. Folded in thirds. Crisp. Untouched. My father gave me the house before he passed. The house Edward always called ours, though, he never noticed my name, was the only one on the deed. He never asked, and I never offered. A woman learns when to keep a signature to herself. My hand didn't tremble when I unfolded it. Property, parcel, heir, Whitlow, not his name, mine, and tucked behind that, a letter in my father's handwriting. Florence, you are allowed to be gentle. You are not required to be small. This house is yours. Use it wisely, Dad. I read it 3 times. Then I went to bed. In the guest room, still facing the empty side. But I slept. The next morning, I called David Whitman. He was once an awkward boy who cried through Chopin and spilled lemonade on my church organ bench. Now he was a lawyer with a reputation for quiet devastations, his words. He picked up on the 3rd ring. "Miss Whitlow," he said. I heard him smile. "Florence," I corrected. "My husband has decided to feel alive. I'd like to help him feel informed." David chuckled. "Tell me everything." I told him what mattered. I told him I wasn't angry, not exactly. I told him about the lipstick on Edward's collar, the lingerie receipt, the note. I told him about the house, the deed, and the chest. And I told him I wasn't ready to shout. But I was ready to write. He said he'd be over that afternoon. When he arrived, I had tea ready. Earl Grey, 2 sugars. I remember because he looked around and said, "Same wallpaper, same piano, same tea." I can't tell if this is comforting or dangerous. I said both. We sat at the kitchen table where the note still lay like a guest refusing to leave. David read the deed. Then he looked at me. You know, you could keep everything he said. I don't want everything I said. He nodded. But you don't want him to have it either. I didn't answer. I just folded the note and placed it in the fireplace. The flames licked the edges, curling the ink into whispers. My husband wanted to feel alive again. I decided it was time I did too. But I would do it with silence. And a signature. The funny thing about silence is how quickly it fills a room. It doesn't knock. It just stretches into the corners like smoke curling around your ankles and whispering. You're alone now, but alone isn't always bad. By day 3, the coffee tasted stronger. My back hurt a little less in the mornings. And for the first time in what felt like years, I played the piano again. Only 3 keys, G, E, and D. I played them slowly like lighting a candle. Not a song, just the feeling of sound under my fingers. David had returned that morning with paperwork. I expected law talk. What I didn't expect was the question he asked before he opened his briefcase. Florence, he said, do you want revenge or release? I paused. Is there a difference? He didn't smile this time. Revenge means keeping score. Release means setting the board on fire. That's when I asked him to help me do both. We began with the basics. The house, the accounts, the insurance policies. He helped me open a new trust in my name, just mine, and transferred the house deed into it with a clause Edward would never see coming. Let him think it's still ours, I said. Let him think I'm still waiting. David nodded. Then we let him walk right into a mirror. I didn't answer Edward's calls for the first few weeks. He left messages that ranged from civil, I hope you're okay, to patronizing, I'll send someone to fix the gutters, to ultimately annoyed. I never erased them. I saved them. You never know what a lawyer might need. In one, I heard her voice in the background. High-pitched. Laughing. She called him Teddy. No one had called him that since the 70s. Not even his own mother. I deleted that one. Then I visited the bank. It was a small branch one where I'd smiled through so many transactions over the years that the tellers greeted me like family. I told them I wanted to separate all joint accounts. Close and transfer. Without a trace. They handed me forms. I didn't hesitate. Would you like checks with your name only? The clerk asked kindly. I looked up. No, I'd like peace. And peace apparently came in the form of 2 certified letters. One went to Edward. The other to the woman he was now renting a flat with, the same one who used to be our dental hygienist. She once complimented my teeth. Said they held up remarkably well. The letter simply read, the estate you once shared no longer belongs to you. Kindly vacate the illusion that you ever mattered more than my silence. David said it was passive-aggressive poetry. I called it closure. By the 3rd week, I saw my son James. He came by unexpectedly with his daughter. She ran up the walk holding a crayon drawing of a cat that looked more like a squash. Mimi, she shouted. I held her breathing in the apple shampoo in her hair and remembered the first time I held James, red, wrinkled, furious. Now he looked tired. Dad called. He said, standing in the kitchen like he didn't belong in it. Said you were being cold? I stirred soup on the stove. I've been cold for 20 years, James. He's just now noticing. He looked down. You don't have to punish him. I turned wooden spoon in hand. You think this is punishment? He didn't answer. I offered him soup. He left before it boiled. The nights were hardest, not because I missed Edward, but because everything reminded me of who I had been for 50 years and how much of her had vanished inside a man who forgot how to look at me. I found a letter I'd written years ago, never sent. It began, Dear Edward, I miss the way you used to ask how I liked my eggs even after 40 years. I miss the way your hand found mine at funerals without a word. But lately I feel like a lamp no one turns on anymore. I folded it, burned it. Not out of anger, but because I finally had nothing left to prove. Then came the organ. Our church had called. The youth pastor asked if I could sub on Sunday. The usual pianist had the flu. I almost said no, but something inside me stirred. That part of me that once played funeral hymns and wedding marches and lullabies for congregants. I didn't even know. I said yes. Sunday morning, I sat at that old wooden bench with its squeaky pedal and peeling varnish. My fingers trembled at first. Then I played, and the music, though simple, filled the sanctuary with something I hadn't heard in weeks. Me, not Mrs. Whitlow, not the wife, not the woman left behind. Just Florence. The pews clapped politely, but one woman came up after and gripped my hands. "That was beautiful," she said. "You looked like someone who survived something." I looked at her and whispered I did. I found the suitcase a week later. It was tucked in the attic crawlspace behind a box of Christmas lights and a dusty box marked Edward's college things. I hadn't been up there in years. The bulb flickered. The air was dry and smelled like old insulation and ghosts. Inside the suitcase were photos. Not of us. Of him before me, beside her, long after us. They weren't scandalous. Nothing like the soap operas suggest. Just ordinary. Edward laughing on a boat. Edward in a wine bar. Edward wearing a sweater I'd never seen. In one photo, she's kissing his cheek. He's smiling the way he used to when the kids were small, and money was tight, and we made it work anyway. I sat on the floorboards staring at them, and I felt nothing. It was strange. No heat, no sadness. Just a vacancy where heartbreak should have lived. I realized then I had done my grieving years ago. Not when he walked out, but during the countless dinners where he barely spoke. The anniversaries forgotten. The quiet withdrawals. The day he left wasn't the betrayal. It was the formality. I took the photos, tied them in a ribbon, and mailed them to his new address with a note that read, "For the scrapbook you're building, I won't be in the next volume. Florence." That night I ordered a new piano. It arrived 2 weeks later. Black lacquered upright crisp keys untouched by sorrow. The delivery men struggled with the steps, sweating and apologizing. I offered lemonade and told them where to set it in the sunroom, where the light was warmest. I touched the keys. CDE. It felt like reclaiming a voice. That same afternoon, David dropped by. Not in a professional capacity. Just David with an old jazz record under his arm and a grin that suggested he brought news. He sat while I poured tea. "You've made waves," he said. "Oh." He slid an envelope across the table. Inside was a court document. Edward had attempted to challenge the trust. Tried to argue that the house was a marital asset. Tried to undo what I'd secured. But he failed. Judge said it was airtight. David said, "Your father would be proud." I sipped my tea. He always said, "Measure twice, sign once." David leaned in. He also said you were the smartest person he knew. I didn't answer. Instead, I asked a question I hadn't dared until then. Do men ever realize what they lost? David didn't blink. No, but they remember it when no one else is looking. My youngest daughter Rachel called not long after. She's always been the closest to Edward. The one who took his side in arguments, called me too traditional, told me once that women like me made silence a virtue when it should have been a sin. She asked to meet for coffee. I agreed. She chose a sleek cafe downtown where the chairs were too modern and the music too loud. She wore sunglasses indoors. "Mom," she said, "are you okay?" I smiled. "I'm learning how to be." She fidgeted. "Dad says you froze the accounts." I secured my assets, I corrected. She sighed. "He's not doing well." I raised an eyebrow. "He made a choice." "I know," she said, "but he's still Dad." I stirred cream into my coffee. "And I'm still me." She looked away, lips pressed. Then, "I used to think you were weak, that you stayed too long, gave too much. And now, I think I never really looked at you." I didn't cry. Not in that cafe. Not in front of the barista who spelled my name wrong on the cup. Not while Rachel sat there blinking hard. But when I got home, I played the piano until the sun went down. The seasons changed. Leaves turned, fell, and melted under first snow. Edward tried calling again, 3 voicemails in 1 week. I never picked up. On the 4th attempt, he left a message that stopped me cold. "I didn't think you'd actually let me go." Let him go. No, I set him free. But only after unbinding myself first. One Saturday, I found an envelope on my doorstep. No name. Just an address I didn't recognize. Inside, a single photo. Me and Edward, 25 years ago, standing outside this very house. He's kissing my forehead. I'm laughing. On the back, "You were the best part of me." I didn't deserve it. I burned it in the fireplace. Some memories are tombstones, some blueprints. I'd spent 50 years building a life on quicksand. I was done mourning the house that sank. I was building a lighthouse now. And so I began to live, really live. Joined a book club. Took walks every morning. Played the piano for a local children's choir. I adopted a cat named Henry. I painted the guest room yellow. I invited silence in, not as punishment, but as peace. Edward. He faded into the periphery. A name on old mail. A laugh I didn't quite remember. A lesson sharp but finished. What he took from me was history. What I kept was the rest of my life. The fourth Sunday of spring, I stood in my kitchen folding tea towels still warm from the dryer when the doorbell rang. It was James. Alone this time. No daughter, no wife, no nervous glances. Just him, my oldest. My boy who once scraped his knees chasing fireflies and now carried the weight of 2 mortgages, 3 kids, and 1 deeply disappointed father. "Can I come in?" he asked. I nodded, motioning to the kitchen. The kettle was already warm. We sat across from each other, hands wrapped around matching mugs. Silence humming between us. "I didn't come to defend him," James said finally. "Good," I replied. He took a breath. "I came because I miss you." That pierced something deeper than I expected. "Rachel told me about your conversation," he continued. "She said you didn't flinch." "I did," I said softly, "just not where she could see it." James looked down. I didn't know what he was planning. None of us did. One day he was talking about installing a new fence. Next day he's moved out. With her. She was our dental hygienist, I reminded him. He gave a short, humorless laugh. Ironic, isn't it? The woman who cleaned our teeth now took half the family. She didn't take anything from me. He looked up. No, I suppose not. That evening, James stayed for dinner. We didn't talk about Edward again. Instead, we talked about his daughter's science fair, his wife's new job, and whether or not he should buy a riding mower. I listened, offered opinions when asked, and felt something strange blooming in my chest. Hope, not for reconciliation, but for redefinition. Edward may have fractured our foundation, but I could still rebuild what stood atop it. I wasn't waiting for him to apologize. I was moving on without permission. Weeks later, a letter arrived. Cream-colored envelope, embossed initials, E. Inside was a handwritten note. The script was unmistakably his slightly slanted meticulous, as if afraid to be misunderstood. Florence, I've thought about how to say this 1,000 times. There are no excuses that will make sense to you. And maybe that's the point. I wasn't looking for someone else. I was just tired of feeling unseen. But now I realize you saw everything. You always did. I'm staying with my brother in Georgia. I've asked the kids not to involve me in anything unless absolutely necessary. I want you to know. I signed the withdrawal. The house. The trust. It's yours. Entirely. I won't challenge it again. For what it's worth, I'm sorry. Not for leaving, but for not leaving sooner when we both knew the light had gone out. I folded the letter. Did I feel vindicated? Not really. Just validated. Like the last piece of a puzzle had quietly clicked into place. I filed the letter away. Then I played the piano for an hour, letting every key hold a bit of release. Summer arrived with fireflies. The garden bloomed better than ever. I spent mornings pruning roses, pulling weeds, and letting sunlight bronze my arms. David visited once a week with pastries and legal updates, though mostly we talked about books, music, and our shared love of lemon tea. "You're glowing," he said one morning as we sat on the porch. "It's the sunscreen," I deadpanned. He smiled, then added, "No, it's something else. You're lighter." I considered that. Was I? Maybe grief has a weight limit, and once you shed the need to be forgiven, your spine realigns. David reached into his satchel and pulled out a small box. "What's this?" "Call it a thank you," he said. "Or a bribe to keep playing the piano at church." I opened it. A silver metronome. Sleek, minimal, engraved on the side. "For the woman who rewrote time." I blinked, touched. "David." "No speeches," he said. "Just keep going." That night, I sat at the piano, the metronome ticking softly beside me. One beat at a time. Forward. Always forward. The thing about betrayal isn't the rupture, it's the silence that follows. It lingers in the hallways, creeps into the corners of every ordinary moment. A cup of coffee alone, an empty seat beside you at the movies, a missing toothbrush. But the real transformation doesn't happen in grief. It happens in what you do next. I started painting again. Nothing grand, just small canvases, still lifes, soft watercolors. Lemons in a bowl. The curve of a magnolia petal. Sometimes I'd finish one and think, this would look lovely in a kitchen that feels like mine. And that's when it hit me. I wasn't living in the house Edward and I built anymore. I was living in my home now. Every drawer rearranged. Every photo reframed. Every corner scrubbed clean of memories I no longer needed to carry. I held no delusions about justice. He wasn't living in misery. I'd heard he bought a little fixer-upper in Savannah and was remodeling it with the help of his new partner's son. Good for him. But I wasn't trying to win a race. I had already won the stillness. One afternoon, the doorbell rang again. I half expected another unexpected family drop-in, but it was a young woman in business slacks holding a clipboard. "Mrs. Whitlow," she asked. "That's me. I'm from the Chamber of Commerce. We're recognizing local women who've contributed to community arts. Your name was recommended by half the music teachers in the district." I blinked. "Why?" She smiled. "You've been donating piano hours every week to the school and the retirement center. The children adore you. The elders say your music makes them remember how to feel. They nominated you for the Quiet Impact Award." I stood there barefoot in my kitchen apron, dusted with flour, holding a dish towel like it was a shield. "Thank you," I whispered. "But I didn't think anyone noticed." "They did," she said. "Sometimes the softest voices leave the deepest echoes." At the award ceremony, Rachel came with me. She wore a soft navy dress and held my hand before I went on stage. Her eyes welled up as I accepted the plaque, an abstract sculpture shaped like a ripple in water. "You know," she said afterward, "you've become someone I'd want to grow up to be." I held her cheek. "You already are." We hugged under the moonlight. Two women who had once misunderstood each other, now standing in alignment. Quiet, healed, and real. That night, I returned home to a voicemail from Edward. Just static at first, then. "Saw the article. You always did make things beautiful even when I didn't deserve it. I hope you're happy, Florence." I deleted it. Not out of anger. Out of peace. Some voices don't belong in the new song you're composing. Weeks passed. I hosted a garden tea for my neighbors. I read poetry at the library's open mic night. I learned how to make lavender scones that didn't fall apart. David started walking me home from the church on Sunday afternoons, pausing at my gate as if words were hanging unsaid. "You're not what I expected," he said one day, watching the wind shift the hydrangeas. "I get that a lot," I replied. Then he added, "But you're exactly what I admire." I blushed. At 74, imagine that. One evening, as the sun melted across the horizon, I opened the last drawer in our old dresser, the one I never touched. Inside was Edward's watch, the one I gave him on our 20th anniversary. Still ticking. I held it for a long time. Then I walked it to the river, said a silent thank you, and let it sink beneath the surface. Because love can be real and still be wrong. Because 50 years can matter and still need to end. Because I can mourn a man I once loved and still never want him back. And that too is grace. The next chapter of my life unfolded quietly like a sunrise most people sleep through. There were no trumpets, no sudden revelations, just a deep, humming kind of freedom that followed me around like a soft scarf. I began traveling not far, not extravagant, just enough. A weekend in Asheville to see the fall leaves. A bus ride to Charleston to visit an old friend from college. A quiet retreat in the mountains where the only sounds were wind in the trees and the occasional creak of a wooden chair. Everywhere I went, I brought a journal and a scarf that once belonged to my mother. I'd sit under trees or on quiet benches writing things down. I never had time to say aloud when I was someone's wife, "I am more than what I endured. I am what I chose to become after." At the retreat, there was a small group session. I almost skipped it. I didn't like sharing in circles. But something pulled me in. A woman, probably late 50s, spoke first. Her husband had passed away, and her children had drifted. She said she often wondered if she was invisible. Another spoke of being left after 30 years, her partner now living with someone half her age. Then they turned to me. I was a wife for 50 years, I said. Gasps. Wide eyes. I was abandoned in the most polite, silent way possible. He didn't raise his voice or pack his bags in the dead of night. He just faded until there was nothing left but my echo in the house. Silence. Then one woman whispered, "And now?" I looked around the room. And now I'm finally becoming someone I'd choose to spend the rest of my life with. The applause wasn't loud, but it was real. So were the tears. That night, I walked back to my cabin with a new kind of ache, the kind that comes when old scars stretch as you grow. It's not pain, it's expansion. And expansion, I've learned, is the antidote to every way the world tries to shrink you. When I returned home, a package waited on the porch. No return address. Inside, a simple frame with a photo of my wedding day. Edward smiling. Me and Ivory. Young, hopeful, foolish. A sticky note attached. For what it meant, not what it became. I stared at it a long time. Then I slid the note off, opened the frame, replaced the photo with one from the award ceremony. Me standing tall, holding the ripple-shaped sculpture light on my face. I put it on the mantle, not to erase the past, but to honor the moment I started again. Weeks turned to months. The local high school asked me to speak at their Women's Leadership Forum. I said yes, partly out of surprise, partly because the woman who called sounded so hopeful I'd accept. "Tell your story," she said. "They need to hear from women who have lived." So I stood on that stage before 75 girls with pens in their hands and dreams in their eyes, and I told them, sometimes the greatest love story you'll ever live is the one where you save yourself. They clapped. Some cried. One even hugged me afterward, whispering, "I think my mom needs to hear this too." I gave her my card. It felt like passing on a torch I once thought had gone out. David came by that night. He brought wine, not paperwork. We sat under the pergola lights twinkling above us, stars stretching wide. "You know," he said, "I once believed justice was what you got in court. And now," he looked at me, eyes steady, "now I believe it's what you live when you stop letting others define you." I raised my glass. "To quiet revolutions," I said. "To women who refuse to stay erased," he replied. We drank, and the world felt full. Autumn arrived like a confession, slow, golden, undeniable. The air smelled different, more honest. Trees shed what no longer served them, and I followed suit. I gave away the last of Edward's old books to the local library. I donated his overcoats to the veterans' shelter. I even sold the antique writing desk he loved but never used. It wasn't anger, it was release. I kept only one thing of his, a photograph from our 40th anniversary trip to Maine. We were sitting on a wooden bench near the sea backs to the camera, his hand barely resting on mine. I didn't save it because of what it showed. I saved it because I remember how cold his fingers felt that day. Even then, he was already leaving. My days found a rhythm. Morning walks to the bakery, midday tea in the garden, afternoons volunteering at the community center where I taught watercolor to teenagers who thought no one saw them. I saw them. Because once I had been invisible too. One day, while I was packing up my brushes, a girl named Lacey stayed behind. She was tall and awkward and wore sleeves that covered too much for a mild day. "You know what I like about you," she said. I smiled. "What's that?" "You don't ask questions, you don't want answers to." I nodded. "And you don't say things unless they matter." She smirked. "Can I come next week even if I'm not enrolled?" "You never needed permission." She left. And I sat there, suddenly filled with the kind of pride no certificate ever granted me. That winter, I hosted a small gathering at my home. Just 6 of us. David, Rachel, James, and his wife Lacey, and a young violinist from the church who always reminded me of myself at 17. We played music. We read poetry aloud. We shared soup and stories. No one mentioned Edward. And for the first time in years, I didn't imagine his absence. I didn't fill in his shape at the end of the table. There was no hole to patch, no phantom limb. He had simply dissolved. A week later, Rachel surprised me with something. She had found the old family videotapes and had them digitized. One night we watched them together on her laptop. Birthdays, Christmas mornings, backyard cookouts. There, I was 35, laughing in a wide-brimmed hat. 40, chasing James with a hose. 50, holding a cake while Edward fumbled with candles. I didn't cry, but I did feel a strange, aching tenderness for the woman I had been. She tried. She loved deeply. She held on longer than she should have. She didn't fail. She just grew beyond the life she was once given. Rachel closed the laptop and looked at me. "Are you glad it ended?" she asked. "No," I answered truthfully. "I'm glad it mattered. And I'm even more glad it's over." She smiled. I squeezed her hand. The next morning, I received a letter. "No return address." Again. Inside was a small newspaper clipping. A short obituary. Edward Whitlow, 77, passed peacefully at his home in Georgia. That was it. No mention of his children. No mention of a new wife. Just a final line that read, "He spent his last days in quiet reflection surrounded by photographs of the ocean." I stared at it. I didn't feel triumph, or vengeance, or closure. Just stillness. And in that stillness, a realization bloomed. I didn't need an apology. I didn't need a reckoning. I had become the woman I once hoped he'd help me be. And I did it all after he left. That evening, I lit a candle. Not for him, but for me. For the girl who loved too long. For the woman who let go too late. And for the soul who somehow still learned to bloom in the dark. The candle burned low as the evening settled around me, soft and dignified. I sat by the window with a blanket over my legs, watching the wind dance through the trees outside. There was no music playing, no television humming in the background, just the quiet comfort of a house finally filled with peace. Edward's death didn't change my life. His departure had already done that. But something in the finality, the printed notice, the smallness of his obituary made everything feel like the last page of a long, weathered book. A story I had read too many times and finally understood. It was over. Truly, deeply, permanently. The next morning, I surprised myself. I called a lawyer, not for any revenge, not to update anything, but to ask one question. "Can I set up a scholarship fund?" I asked. "For what kind of cause?" He replied. I paused. "For women starting over. After divorce, widowhood, betrayal, whatever the reason. Women who lost everything and still chose to rebuild." He said it was one of the most specific and noble ideas he'd heard in years. We drafted it that week. The Florence Whitlow Foundation for Second Chances. I funded it with money I once imagined spending on anniversary trips or grandchildren's college tuitions, dreams that hadn't come true, but still held value in a different form. Rachel cried when I told her. "You're turning pain into possibility," she said. "No," I corrected gently. "I'm turning a past I didn't choose into a legacy I own." And that, more than any amount of money or recognition, felt like the full circle I'd been waiting to step into. One day, months later, David came over with a strange smile. "I need you to see something," he said. He drove me out to a nearby plot of land, flat, wild, full of weeds and sunlight. This was going to be developed into a strip mall, he said. But I talked them out of it. Bought it instead. I blinked. "Why?" He turned toward me. "I want to build a community arts center here. Music, painting, storytelling. All the things you've taught me matter." I stared at the open land. "You want me to help?" "I want you to lead." My throat tightened. "I'm not that kind of woman," I said. He smiled, warm and unwavering. "You became that kind of woman." So we began planning, drawing, dreaming, even naming the House of Quiet Echoes, because everything the world once ignored, every overlooked voice, every discarded dream deserved a place to be heard again. I taught classes in a sunny room with large windows. Lacey came to speak to younger girls about boundaries and bravery. James donated books. Rachel painted murals with children who had never been told their imagination had value. It wasn't a replacement for what I lost. It was proof that my story didn't end there. On the center's opening day, the mayor gave a short speech. He called me to the front and handed me a plaque. It simply read, "Florence Whitlow, for teaching us that silence can be strength." I didn't cry then, but But I did cry that night alone in the building, lights off, surrounded by the ghosts of women like me who would finally have somewhere to begin again. And I whispered not to Edward but to the universe, "Thank you for leaving. I would have never become this woman if I had stayed your wife." The days flowed like honey, steady, slow, golden. Life, it turned out, could be tender after betrayal. Not because it forgets, but because it finally stops bleeding. At the House of Quiet Echoes, I watched as women came through the doors with tired eyes and left with something in their hands: paint-smeared brushes, sheets of music, typed pages of their stories. Their voices grew stronger with each session, and sometimes their laughter filled the halls like church bells. It became a sanctuary. One morning, while placing fresh flowers in the lobby, a woman hesitated at the threshold. She had cropped silver hair, wore a coat 2 sizes too big, and held a plastic bag with a Tupperware inside. "Are you open?" she asked, almost like asking permission to exist. "Always," I said. She stared at the sign on the wall, our motto hand-painted by Rachel, "Where silence is not weakness but a beginning." Her eyes watered. "I don't have a story yet," she whispered. I walked toward her. "You do," I replied. "You're just in the part where the world starts listening." She joined our Tuesday writing group that week. Her name was Eleanor. 3 months later, she performed a poem that made the mayor cry. James dropped by unexpectedly one afternoon. He walked through the garden path holding a small wooden box. "I found this in Dad's things," he said. "I think you should have it." It was Edward's old letterbox, one he kept for decades, storing random notes and clippings. I hadn't seen it in years. I opened it slowly. Inside were dozens of cards I'd written him over the years. Anniversary notes. Just because scribbles. Little hearts I'd drawn on receipts and napkins. He'd kept them all, and tucked in the back, folded tightly. A letter he'd written but never sent. I paused. James nodded. "You don't have to read it. I just thought you deserved to decide." Later that night, alone, under the soft hum of a table lamp, I unfolded the letter. "Florence, if you're reading this, I've probably already failed at becoming the man you deserved. You gave me decades, and I repaid you with distance. I don't know why I left when I did. Maybe I thought freedom would feel better. Maybe I thought I had time to fix it. I was wrong on both counts. You were always the better part of us. Edward." I stared at his handwriting, not because it changed anything, but because even in regret, he still didn't understand. I hadn't needed him to become the man I deserved. I had needed to become the woman who finally knew her own worth. That night, I burned the letter, not in anger, but in ceremony. Ashes fell into a copper bowl I kept in the garden. I scattered them at the base of the new magnolia tree, the one we planted at the center's entrance. Eleanor helped me water it every Thursday. Rachel painted a bench beside it. We called it the Tree of Unfinished Stories. Months passed. The foundation grew. We received a grant that allowed us to launch satellite programs in other towns. I traveled light, steady, speaking not as someone who had all the answers, but as someone who had learned to ask better questions. And in quiet moments between classes, between flights, between seasons, I thought of who I used to be. A wife, a mother, a woman pacing her kitchen, hoping her silence would be heard like thunder. And now I was the storm. I never thought I'd be someone who gave speeches. Microphones used to make me nervous. Attention made me shrink. But now I stood on stages not because I wanted applause, but because I knew someone in the back row needed to hear that it was okay to start again at 74. That day, I was invited to a conference for women founders. The room was filled with executives, nonprofit leaders, and artists in flowing scarves. I stood behind the podium and glanced at the crowd. They didn't know my story yet, but they would. I opened with the truth. My name is Florence Whitlow. I was a wife for 50 years. And then I wasn't. My husband left me for another woman. I thought I'd die from the silence. Instead, I built a home out of it. A pause. You could hear hearts tightening. He walked away. I stayed behind. And I discovered I was never behind. I was beginning. The applause came later, but it didn't matter. What mattered were the tears in the eyes of women who waited in line afterward to whisper their own versions of my story. I thought I was the only one. I left, but I have nowhere to go yet. He took everything, even the dog. I held their hands. I nodded. I listened. Because sometimes the most powerful thing we can offer each other isn't advice. It's witness. That night, I returned to my hotel and found a small card slipped under the door. It read, "Your words cracked something open. Thank you for showing us how to survive. No name, no contact. Just a crack. That was enough." Back at the House of Quiet Echoes, we created a new wall, the Wall of Firsts. Each woman wrote down something they did for the first time since being betrayed, left, or forgotten. Bought myself flowers. Took the window seat. Said no and didn't explain. Danced. Alone. Happy. I added mine. Lit a candle just for me. Rachel came into my office one afternoon holding a worn photograph. "Look," she said, placing it gently in front of me. It was our old family photo, Edward, James, Rachel, and me, taken back when we still wore matching holiday sweaters and overcooked the turkey. For a moment, I braced for a wave of nostalgia or pain, but it didn't come. Only gratitude. "That's who I was," I said quietly. Rachel nodded. "And now," I smiled. "Now I'm someone I chose to become." We hung the photo in the hallway not out of longing, but as a map, a marker of where I began and how far I'd come. The women who passed it always paused, not because they recognized me, but because they recognized themselves. In the quiet wife, the almost forgotten mother, the woman who once made everyone else's life softer until she finally turned that softness toward herself. One evening, as the sky blushed lavender and gold, I stood at the garden gate and watched the magnolia tree sway. Eleanor was watering it. Lacey sat nearby sketching. David was inside helping someone set up for open mic night. And I was whole. Not because I healed perfectly, but because I allowed the cracks to fill with light instead of shame. I whispered to no one in particular. "You left thinking you took everything. But all you really did was leave the space I needed to become me." The wind rustled through the branches like laughter. And for the first time, I felt it. Not just freedom, but joy. There's something strangely beautiful about waking up and having no one to answer to but yourself. No schedules dictated by someone else's moods. No meals cooked around another's cravings. No wondering if your silence would make him love you more or less. Just peace. I kept a morning ritual now. 1 cup of tea, 1 page from a poetry book, 1 affirmation written by hand and taped to the mirror. That morning's note read, "She remembered who she was," and the game changed. At the community center, I met a woman who reminded me of myself 20 years ago. Her name was Elise. She was 60, newly divorced and quiet in a way that wasn't shy. It was self-protective. I asked her once after class what brought her here. She looked down at her paint-stained hands and said I was tired of feeling like an echo in someone else's life. I told her I used to be the same. "You," she said. "But you run this place." I smiled. "Before I ran this place, I ran away from myself." She stared, stunned. And I saw it happen. Her eyes softened, her spine straightened. Because someone like me, admitting I had once been small, gave her permission to expand. That's what I learned most from the betrayal. It didn't just take something from me. It gave me something too. A mission, a voice, and strangely eventually gratitude. Because if Edward had stayed, I would have stayed Florence the wife, and never discovered Florence the creator, the founder, the mother of a new movement. James surprised me one Sunday with a photo album he made. Each page documented the center's growth. Photos of the garden, classrooms, smiling women from all walks of life. The final page was a photo of me at the grand opening standing in front of our engraved sign. "The House of Quiet Echoes, founded by Florence Whitlow." Underneath he wrote, "You gave birth twice, once to us and once to yourself. I'm proudest of the second." I choked on my tea. James had always been the quiet one, but in that sentence he gave me more than Edward ever did in 50 years of marriage. There was one last thread to tie. I visited Edward's grave. It wasn't out of guilt. It was closure. I stood with a bouquet of wildflowers, nothing too fancy. The sky was overcast, the wind gentle. I placed the flowers down and whispered, "You were part of my life, but not the whole story. And I forgive you for not knowing what you had. And I forgive myself for needing you to see it. I didn't cry. I didn't linger. I turned and walked away, my footsteps steady, my spine tall. That chapter was sealed. At home, I lit a candle, the same one I lit every year on the anniversary of my marriage. Only this time, I didn't light it for the memory of the marriage. I lit it for the woman who survived its end, for the one who picked up the ashes and built a sanctuary with them. The candle flickered. The room glowed. And inside me, something steadier than hope burned bright. A woman who once believed love had to come from someone else finally realized it had lived inside her all along. The fall brought amber skies and crisp air. The magnolia tree had started to shed its leaves. Each petal that dropped felt like a letter I'd never sent. A piece of grief no longer needed to be held. We hosted our first Founders Gala in October, not for donors but for the women. A night of music, storytelling, and celebration. No one wore black unless they wanted to. No one asked about exes. No one apologized for crying. It was joy in its rawest, bravest form. And I stood there watching them all laughing, dancing, toasting one another, and I realized this was the life I never knew I was allowed to want. Freedom had a flavor now. It tasted like roasted apples, spiced wine, and laughter you didn't have to shrink for. Rachel pulled me aside mid-evening. "Mom," she said with that tone that meant both seriousness and affection, "have you thought about writing your story down? Like, all of it?" I blinked. "You mean a book?" She nodded. "It's time the world heard what you've been through, and what you've built from it." For a moment I hesitated, not out of fear, but awe. The thought of telling the full truth, not just the polite parts, not just the inspiring pieces, was thrilling and terrifying all at once. But then I looked out over the crowd. Dozens of women, some gray-haired, some tattooed, some still in tears, smiling, alive, radiant in their own becoming. And I knew Rachel was right. That week I began. Mornings became sacred again. I returned to my old desk, the one Edward once called my scribble station, and typed slowly. Not because I didn't have the words, but because I had too many. Each sentence felt like opening a window I had nailed shut years ago. I wrote about the day I married a man I barely knew, the nights I cried into a cold pillow while he stayed out working late, the ways I twisted myself smaller so he could feel bigger, and then the day he left, and the silence, and the slow, powerful rebuild. The title came to me at 2 a.m., like a whisper from my younger self. She stood still. Then she rose, because that's what it felt like. I had once stood so still, so obedient to the life I thought I owed someone else, until I remembered I could move, that I could build, that I could rise. The manuscript took 6 months. James edited it. Rachel designed the cover. Lacey drew a sketch of the magnolia tree for the dedication page. And when it was published, something strange happened. It sold. Thousands of copies. Letters poured in from women in motels, retirement homes, city high-rises, from women who had never spoken aloud what had happened to them. I thought I was broken. One letter said, "But maybe I'm just beginning." The New York Times called me a quiet revolutionary. I laughed. What a thing to be after 75 years of being quiet for everyone but myself. They asked me for an interview. I agreed, but only if we filmed it in the garden under the magnolia tree. When the camera rolled, I said, "I'm not famous. I'm not brave. I just refused to let someone else's absence define the rest of my life." And maybe that was enough. Maybe that was everything. The book brought more than attention. It brought invitations to speak, to consult, to advise. People wanted to know how I had turned betrayal into something beautiful. I said yes selectively. I was too old, too wise to say yes to everything. But there was one event I couldn't turn down. The Women's Council Summit in Washington, D.C., a gathering of women over 50 who had made major life pivots. The invitation came handwritten with a note at the bottom. "We don't want influencers. We want survivors. You are both." I packed light. One black dress, my worn leather notebook, a photograph of the House of Quiet Echoes. And I brought my story, not just the one I'd written, but the one etched into my bones. On stage, the moderator asked me, "Florence, when did you stop being afraid?" The audience went silent. I didn't answer immediately. Then I said, "I haven't. I just stopped letting fear drive." The applause was quiet, contemplative. It wasn't the cheer of excitement. It was the slow rise of women recognizing themselves. And when I walked off that stage, a woman in her 60s grabbed my hand and whispered, "Thank you for being the voice I needed 30 years ago." I held her gaze. "Then let's be that voice now for someone else." Back home, the mailbox overflowed with letters. Not bills, not advertisements, letters. A woman from Idaho wrote that she'd finally left her emotionally abusive husband. Another from Dublin said she started her own tailoring business at 68. A grandmother from Brazil translated my book into Portuguese so her daughter could read it. And tucked into one envelope, handwritten in shaky cursive, was this: "Your story didn't save me. It reminded me I could save myself." That was the point, wasn't it? Not to be anyone's savior, but to be a mirror, a lighthouse, a whisper that says, "You're not alone." Rachel and James planned a surprise event at the house to honor the book's anniversary. I walked in expecting a few friends. What I got was the entire community. Candles lined the walkway. Photos of the center's journey filled the hall. There were booths showcasing the businesses women had started: ceramics, embroidery, catering. At the far end, beneath the magnolia tree, stood a small brass plaque. I leaned in. Florence Whitlow. She didn't rebuild. She reimagined. Tears filled my eyes, not because I was proud, but because I was humbled. Because this was never just my story, it was all of ours. Later that night, Rachel asked me if I had regrets. I paused. "Not about him," I said. "Not anymore. But about staying so long." "Yes," I admitted. "But only because I could have started sooner." She didn't say anything, just took my hand and squeezed it gently. "You're here now," she said. And that was true. I was not as someone's wife, not as a woman forgotten in the margins, but as the author of my own life. I woke up one morning to the scent of cinnamon and the sound of soft humming. Rachel was in the kitchen baking with my granddaughter Lily. They were covered in flour, debating whether raisins belonged in cinnamon rolls. "They do not." I stood in the doorway quietly, just watching. This was the family I had almost never known, the version of us built from choice, not obligation, from truth, not pretense. And I thought, this is what healing looks like. It doesn't always roar. Sometimes it's a whisper of laughter, the clink of measuring cups, the warmth of your own name being said with love. Later that week, a letter arrived. No return address. Inside was a card. It read, "I saw the interview. I'm glad you made something of the ruins." It was unsigned, but I knew who had sent it. Her, Edward's final girlfriend. The woman he'd left me for. She must have seen the interview, or read the book, or heard whispers through mutual friends. I stared at the card for a long while, and then I burned it. Not out of anger, out of liberation. Because even her acknowledgement no longer held weight in my story. Forgiveness, I realized, didn't mean letting someone off the hook. It meant unhooking them from your own heart. I took Lily to the garden that afternoon. We walked slowly, her hand in mine, pausing at each plaque of women who'd donated or taught or mentored others. When we reached the magnolia tree, she asked, "Did you plant this?" "Yes," I said. After everything fell apart, she blinked. "Why?" I knelt beside her and said, "Because when things break, we get to choose what grows next." She nodded as if that made perfect sense. And maybe to her it did. Children understand healing better than adults do. I began teaching again, not literature this time, but legacy writing. Women came with boxes of letters, journals, memories scribbled on the back of receipts. Some stories were full of rage. Others were quiet elegies. All were valid. All were welcome. We cried. We laughed. We wrote. And somewhere in the middle of all that, we healed. Not because someone saved us, but because we gave ourselves permission to be heard. At the end of our first workshop, I handed everyone a small card that read, "You are the keeper of your story. Write it as if your life depends on it, because it does." One woman, 83 and shaking, said it was the first time she'd ever written about what her husband did. Another said, "I think I'm ready to tell my daughter who I was before I was her mom." I looked at them all and felt something rise in me that had nothing to do with pride and everything to do with purpose. Edward may have left with nothing, but I had gained everything. Winter returned with its own kind of hush, but this time the silence didn't feel lonely. It felt earned. The frost on the windows reminded me of all the years I'd sat waiting for a man to come home, for a voice to soften, for a love to return that had never truly arrived. Now I sat by that same window with a cup of tea, writing holiday cards to women around the world who had reached out after reading my book. One of them had lost her home. Another had lost a child. Many had lost themselves. But all of them were building something new out of grief, out of dust, out of sheer defiance. I called them my sisters in ashes, because we weren't just survivors. We were architects of what came after. Rachel came over that evening. James too. Lily brought me a homemade ornament, paper and glue and glitter and all. It read in shaky handwriting, "Grandma is a phoenix." I couldn't help but laugh. "Do you know what a phoenix is?" I asked. Of course, she grinned. "It dies in fire, but then it comes back prettier. Out of the mouths of babes." Later, as we sat by the fire, James asked quietly, "Do you ever miss him? Even a little?" The question floated in the air, soft and sharp. I took a breath. "I miss who I thought he was," I said. "But I don't miss how I felt when I was with him." James nodded slowly. Then he added, "You've done more since he left than most people do in a lifetime." And I knew he meant it. On Christmas morning, I found a small box on my doorstep. Inside was a single magnolia blossom, pressed and dried, and a note. "You taught me how to live out loud. Thank you for not shrinking." No signature. But I knew the handwriting. It belonged to one of the first women who had come to the house. A woman once too afraid to look me in the eyes, who now ran a shelter for displaced grandmothers in Detroit. We don't always get to see the seeds we plant bloom, but sometimes we do, and it's breathtaking. That night, I stood in the garden. Snow had dusted the ground. The magnolia tree stood bare but regal. I whispered into the night, "You tried to erase me, but I became permanent." Then I smiled. Because being left was never the end. It was the beginning of the story I was always meant to write. One where I wasn't just the wife. I was the woman, the fire, the author, the phoenix. They say every great story ends with a full circle, but mine didn't end. It unfolded. Like a letter forgotten in the back of a drawer, creased, faded, yet still legible. Still powerful. After 50 years of shrinking to fit someone else's life, I built my own. No applause. No vengeance wrapped in grand speeches. Just quiet reclamation. A will rewritten in solitude. A house transformed into sanctuary. A voice once buried under compromise now echoed in other women's mouths. And that was enough. No, that was everything. People ask me now what I would tell the woman I was at 20 or 30 or even 60. And I say this: don't wait for someone to hand you permission. Don't wait for the apology that may never come. And don't confuse endurance with love, because endurance is what keeps you alive. But love is what makes you feel alive. And I had finally found that in the warmth of my granddaughter's laughter, in the letters from strangers who became sisters, and in the quiet knowing that I would never again abandon myself for the comfort of someone else. So when I go, it won't be in silence. It will be with a legacy inked not just in paper but in lives mended. A legacy that says, she wasn't just a wife, she wasn't just left, she rose.